Right, let's just get straight to the point of the video. I was laid off. I'm going to talk a bit about that here. If you don't know who I am, I'm Stevo, a self-taught software developer. I've been working sort of in the past 3 to 4 years, somewhere in between there, in tech. And yeah, I was just laid off for the first time. And in tech, that is. I've been laid off in the past, but yeah, I just kind of wanted to go through my situation a bit. For anyone who's not sort of familiar with me in the channel, I sort of talk about my experiences in tech so far, discuss various relevant topics, and give sort of tips and advice based on my learnings so far. But yeah, this one's going to be one of those. Basically, it's going to be just sort of what I can take away and what everyone else can take away from the situation I've just dealt with and what many people are probably dealing with this time of year with the holidays and stuff coming up. I figured this is a good time to be talking about this sort of stuff, especially with the year we've had with the mass amounts of layoffs, especially in tech, in 2023. Although I think no one's safe in any industry this year, really. Layoffs have been, far and wide, stretching across any industry you can think of, pretty much. So this is kind of going to be just applicable to anyone, really, that's been sort of laid off. A lot of it might be sort of more anecdotal to sort of tech-related kind of work, but yeah, I mean, anyone can use this, hopefully. Anyone can take my experience, any sort of tips that I have that helped me, and yeah, hopefully that'll help someone out there. But yeah, first of all, I obviously working as a software developer. I just rolled off a project. I'm not going to get too much into my specific personal situation. It's probably largely the same for a lot of people in terms of how it happens. But basically, I just rolled off a project. Was expecting to go on to a new one, and that work was suddenly cut. Basically, so. Basically, there wasn't capacity for the amount of people that were sort of employed at that company, and so we were let go. A good number of us were let go in various disciplines. It wasn't targeted at anyone specific. It was just kind of a numbers game, really, and that's kind of how it goes for most companies who fall into similar situations. Work dries up. Clients maybe sort of discontinue their work, and therefore the work dries up. No new clients come in, or maybe you're not sort of client driven in that sense. Maybe it's a product that you're working on, a SaaS or something like that, and just customers. There are not as much customers coming in, new customers. Some customers maybe leaving, cancelling subscriptions and things like that. Profit margins sort of get smaller, and and then that leads to layoffs, or maybe just the scope of the sort of work in the future is maybe a bit more narrow than it has been in the past, and maybe there just isn't the need for maybe such a big dev team or a big team doing whatever marketing or whatever your discipline is. And so layoffs are made, obviously, so they don't have to overpay for services they don't need, basically, as a company. And also bankruptcy as well. A lot of companies go bankrupt in hard economical times. A lot of that is happening just now, especially with smaller businesses. And some larger ones as well, obviously. No one's immune to that. There's a number of reasons, basically. For whatever reason, you're probably going to find yourself in amongst a few people. It's very rarely targeted to sort of one or two individuals. And then you all sort of have to scramble to find jobs afterwards. And especially at this time of year, it's a very difficult time of year to do that. Not many companies, I can only really speak for tech, but it's pretty much everyone. Companies don't really hire around this time of year, around sort of December. People are usually winding down for the holidays. It doesn't usually pick up again to sort of January, February, and in my experience anyway. And yeah, it's it can be quite difficult, especially when it's probably one of the most expensive times of year as well. Buying gifts for family members and loved ones and things, while trying to stay afloat. Paying mortgages and stuff, paying off a loan, or paying for a car or something like that. Big expensive bills that very quickly creep up on you when you don't have a monthly income coming in, right? So it's even if you have a sort of emergency fund sort of on the go, which you should, by the way, not your financial advisor, but you should have a few months of emergency savings ideally. But even that sort of goes quickly when you spend even just a couple of months out of work, and then you get into work, and then you don't get your first paycheck. There's sort of like a month or two in, right? It just depending on where you start, and it's difficult. But what I want to do here is sort of help minimize that sort of downtime for people. I was only out of work, I guess until next year. But sort of was made redundant late November, and a couple of weeks later, I'd accepted the role. I mean, it could largely be put down to luck, right? I just happened to talk to the right people at the right time at the end of the day, but there is some sort of element of knowing what to do when it comes to interviews and things like that, that obviously can help a great deal. It can be quite easy to maybe misrepresent yourself in interviews, or just give the wrong impression, or maybe just anxiety and panic sort of sets in and gets the better of you during interviews and things like that. So I kind of want to give some kind of tips and context as to how I get through that sort of stuff relatively easily. For the most part, I mean, I still fumble, I still sort of make a mess of things, but it's more about how you handle those situations as opposed to making sure you perfect everything and stuff like that. It's more important to go in almost knowing that you're not going to get everything right and you're not going to know all the answers, but it's more about how you deal with those situations, how you deal with answering those answers, showing your thought process, collaborating with your potential peers, and also asking the questions as well, because interviews are a two-way street. I think a lot of people forget that as well. Having the questions ready and asking the right questions as well, the relevant questions, can be important. That's like a brief overview of what I'm going to go over. Basically, before you even get to the interviews, how do you get interviews, right? First of all, be ready for them. Even if you're in work just now, if this isn't necessarily relevant to you right now, and you are still in work, or maybe you're feeling a bit anxious with everyone being laid off and stuff, and that's why you're watching this, always be ready for them. Like, regardless of what position you think you're in, you might not necessarily know the whole picture, right, of what's going on behind the scenes. Something could change tomorrow, something, it might be fine, everything might be hunky-dory, and then the next day, it's not. So things can change very fast, especially in tech. Things change at the blink of an eye sometimes, especially this sort of new age of AI and things. Everything's changing every week or so, really, when it comes to that stuff. It really pays off to be prepared, basically, for these sort of situations. So you can just jump in and get it done, basically. Get out of the way, get something, ready, so that, when the new year comes, or whenever, you're available, or whenever your potential employer is available to take you on, you're ready to do that, basically. And you're not sort of hanging around for a while, talking to this, that, and the next person, trying to find your next role, and potentially losing out on a couple of opportunities, because, you haven't quite kept up to date with certain things, or just sort of kept on practicing those interview skills and things. So yeah, that's rule number one, basically, is always be prepared, right? That's sort of the most important thing. But let's say you're not prepared. Let's say there's a couple of things you want to brush up on. I certainly did. I can sit here and say, be prepared and all that, but even I feel like I wish I was more prepared when it happened. In hindsight, hindsight's a great thing, it's a great tool, but unfortunately it doesn't really help us too much, other than just reflection, right? So, yeah, it's all well me saying that, but we should really have a backup plan, I suppose. So if you don't feel like you're quite prepared, there's a couple of things you can do just before an interview, I would say. A couple of things you should do, whether you're prepared or not, really. Even more importantly, though, if you're not prepared or you don't feel you're prepared. And basically, those things, number one, whenever you are going to interview for a company, always do your due diligence on the company. Check them out. Not just what they do and sort of the history behind what they do, and learn the product or learn their services and what they do. Also just check out sort of how well the company's doing. Look them up in Glassdoor, look for potential employee reviews and things, Glassdoor and other places. Try and find out as much as you can about the company, their financials and things like that. I know in the UK, sort of limited companies and things like that, all their sort of public, their sort of financial information is pretty public. Usually you can look that stuff up. So it's always good to know sort of how a company's doing as well financially, because you don't want to go into a new role potentially and all of a sudden the role just gets pulled out from under you, and you haven't noticed something that was very obvious beforehand or something like that. Sometimes that stuff isn't obvious, but I mean, if there's something that is obvious and you can see it and you can avoid it and you can avoid taking the wrong role, then that's absolutely something you should do and prepare. Just always make sure basically that you have all the information you have in a company. And then when you do go to interview for them as well, the most important part, i.e. Being sort of aware of what they do and being knowledgeable about the work that they do, that'll help a ton when it comes to them asking you questions about why you want to work there, why they think you would benefit them as an employee, why you would fit in, both culturally and sort of in a productive sense. You know, how would you make them money, right? That's why they're hiring you. You want to try and align with that as best as possible. And the best way to do that is to have a good idea of what the company's about before you go in. That also sets you up better for asking your own questions as well. You can ask more sort of refined questions and more tailored and specific questions to them, so you can get as much information and background about the company that you couldn't find, say about team culture and things like that, for example, in the interview. It shows interest as well if you're doing all that stuff. And any sort of employer or team that's interviewing you, if you've got plenty of questions to ask them and you know plenty about the company going in, then it makes a huge impression, and it makes them aware that you are clearly invested in the process and want to potentially work with them. So super important. Preparation, that's one of the best things you can do. After that though comes your sort of your soft skills. Right now, technical skills are important and I will come into that, but soft skills are more important than that. Even as an experienced software engineer, or any other sort of discipline you do, if it's technical, your soft skills still come first. Teams ultimately want to work with people who they want to work with, right? People who they can collaborate with, people who are easy to work with. They can take criticism. They can also be sort of constructive about both their own work and other people's work. They're not sort of afraid to give feedback themselves. They can, in a sort of non-toxic way, sort of objectively analyze both their own work and their peers' work, and sort of add to that in a valuable way. Also, just working with teams on a day-to-day basis. Some people struggle with it, in terms of being able to sort of talk about sort of the context of their work and things like that. Sometimes people they'll say something, during stand-up, for example, if you're working for a tech company. If you're a software engineer, we do stand-up in the mornings where sort of you spend 15 minutes to half an hour, depending on sort of what you're doing, sort of going through the team and briefly giving a sort of update on like the current work that each member of the team is working on, and if there's any sort of blockers, and if that can be helped in some way, and then if it can and it needs some other team member, lead or whatever, to have a discussion with them, then they can take that outside of the stand-up, the call. But that's basically a very short meeting. And so a great communication skill to have is being able to deliver context in a super concise way, but in a way that sort of explains everything. And it's a super hard skill to get down. It's not as easy as it sounds. And so like that's an example of like a soft skill, say as a software engineer, or anyone in sort of a technical role, that you can have that can be sort of conveyed, I guess, in an interview, especially if there's like a sort of pair programming session or something like that, where you have to collaborate with say another developer or something like that. It can be very good to be able to convey that sort of ability to sort of talk about your thought process and in sort of a concise way and explain things, sort of what we call rubber ducking in tech as well, where you sort of you just sort of talk out loud and explain your problem until it makes sense to someone, right, including yourself. And being able to do that super well is a huge plus for a lot of companies. That, and obviously other soft skills as well, but that's just a sort of more niche example. I mentioned technical skills as well. That would be sort of the third thing I was thinking of. Technical skills are super important, especially if you're in sort of tech. If you're a software developer, you need to be able to do the work, right? So you will be tested on your knowledge, most likely, as a developer. If you're a junior, you might not really. I remember when I was getting my first sort of job or two as a junior, it was more about who you were as a person. It still is, even as like a sort of mid-level, but there's more technical challenges involved in that, to sort of almost prove your experience, I guess. But as a junior, it might not be too sort of prevalent in the interview process. These days it might be, because of how challenging it is to sort of get your foot in the door. There's a lot of people trying to get roles, especially as a software engineer, juniors and graduates and things. And so there might be more of a technical component to it, even in entry-level positions, entry-level, quote unquote. So it might still be relevant, but especially as someone a bit more experienced with a couple of years, someone who might have been laid off, someone who this might be relevant to or more relevant to, technical skills are obviously still important. And so you need to have that kind of up to date. You will be tested on it, whether it's through sort of a take-home test or sort of a variety of questions on an interview, say if it's like multiple choice questions or just sort of a more open-ended kind of choice question. What would you do in a certain situation? How would you use this technology to do this thing? That kind of stuff, right? And then there's the pair programming side of things as well, which is maybe not as common as it used to be, but a lot of times as well you get more of a whiteboardy kind of thing where you'll have a challenge to solve, and you'll have to sort of talk your way through the solution while a developer sort of listens to you and maybe gives some pointers here or there, and you sort of bounce ideas off each other and things like that. The idea there is not necessarily to show how good you are at programming or whatever, in the context of software developers. It's more, it's actually more of a soft skill thing. It is more your ability to collaborate and your ability to talk out loud and explain your thought process. But it does kind of display your knowledge in a sort of secondary sense as well. It's just not really too applicable in that sense to how you work on a day-to-day basis. It's a very different environment, so a lot of companies I think are starting to steer away from that in terms of trying to get a gauge on actual technical knowledge, but it's still a thing. So be prepared for either sort of pair programming, stay up to date with your sort of algorithms and things. If you're a software engineer, your data structures, algorithms, that kind of stuff. Just the basic problems. You don't need to go super advanced lead code or anything like that, right? Unless you're trying to get into Fang or something. Just make sure you can do sort of basic stuff, some common problems, stuff like anything to do, any basic kind of form stuff, or like anything to do with strings, having to sort characters or stuff like that, fizz buzz, right? Just the basic easy kind of questions that you typically learn in the first year or two anyway, when you're sort of learning to code, right? So yeah, try and stay up to date with that stuff, but it's not nearly as important as sort of the soft skills and knowing the tools that you use. So for example, if you're a software developer, say if you're a web developer specifically, you might be using a lot of JavaScript in your day-to-day, using like frameworks like React, Vue, Angular, stuff like that. You want to be quite versed in that stuff. If that's the kind of role you're going for, if you're going for something that's specifically a React developer, for example, they more than likely than not will ask you questions about React. So you want to make sure that you know exactly what you're talking about with that stuff. When it comes to the technical stuff, it's probably super important to look at the role you're applying for, look at the primary technology that they're looking for experience in, and just being like super aware of it and being super like aware, even if you don't necessarily know everything about it, if you're not an expert, just be aware of the things you're not too comfortable with, and then also be honest about that if you're not, and ask questions about it. Even would you be working with that on a day-to-day basis? Should I brush up on it a bit more, things like that if you're not too sure. But ultimately you should just be aware, have the context of sort of the tool as a whole. Be an expert in the things you're an expert in. Don't try to be an expert in the things that you're not. If anything, ask questions about it and be curious. And yeah, that's kind of your bread and butter, really. Just try and be really good with the kind of thing that you're going for. If you're more of a generalist and you sort of hop around and try different things out, say that you've got a sort of widespread knowledge of various tools, frameworks and things like that. You want to get hands-on with this, that and the next thing though. It really depends on the role you're going for and what kind of knowledge you have. It's more about how you approach it, and it has to be tailored to each interview that you do. You can't just have a one process that fits all, because it's very obvious if you do. So make sure you, as I said, look into the company, see what they're doing, see what the company is like, how they're operating, When you're in an interview, ask, what the team culture's like. You can ask them a few questions, which I'm going to get into as well. Some questions I like to ask that might throw up red flags and things. And then be super aware of like the frameworks and tools and coding languages and things that they use. Even if you're not an expert on everything, just kind of know what they're looking for. And if you're not an expert in it and you can't communicate your knowledge effectively on one particular topic, don't sweat about it. Just don't pretend that you know. Just try and be honest about it and ask the questions. Be curious. Make it obvious that you're willing to learn and that you're keen to learn. That's super important, especially as a more experienced developer or experienced anything. Still having that desire to learn and being able to communicate that in an interview is quite important and can be quite encouraging for a lot of potential employers to see. Finally, I just want to get on as well. I'm going to wrap this up quite quickly because it's getting on a bit now. But my last thing as well, I've got a few questions that I like to ask employers and things. Just some little things, not necessarily to trip them up, just things that if they answer a certain way, you might want to have a think about it and maybe be a bit skeptical, I guess, about the position. The first one I always ask companies is whether it's just one, two, or three people on like a panel or whatever interviewing you. It doesn't matter. I like to ask every individual person in the call what their favourite thing is about working there. The reason being because their response, whether they're meaning to or not, depending on how they answer it, it could sort of give away certain things about the company, right? So, for example, if one of them says their favourite thing about the company is the coffee, right, and almost try and make like a light-hearted joke about it, chances are they're only half joking, right? It could be a bit of a red flag. Might not necessarily be. They might just be joking, right? But quite likely it could be. It could be a mask for they don't like it there, they hate it there. They don't have anything else better to say. If they then follow that up with something, right, it's maybe a bit better than just I like the coffee, right? But it's I like the pizza parties or something, I like the pool table to use at lunch and stuff. Yeah, it's more you have to kind of gauge it on the vibe, I guess. But quite often when people make jokes like that and seem almost sort of uncomfortable whenever you ask questions like that, it's usually because they feel a certain way and are trying not to give it away. So yeah, just when it comes to like things like that, and also if you ask, say, like how's the culture, do the teams communicate, what's communication look like, if you're remote, are people quite active on Slack and things like that, and if they reply with yeah, people talk sometimes, yeah, like things stuff like that, they try and go they hum and haw a bit, that can also be a bit of a red flag. If they don't have a clear, oh yeah, everyone's super active, there's tons of channels everyone likes to talk in if you're remote, if you use Slack a lot, or there's loads of talk in the office and things, and people are really sociable, teams communicate, between teams and things, there's a lot of collaboration going on. If they're not quick to jump to that sort of answer and they kind of hum and haw a bit and try and sort of create an answer out of thin air, I guess, that would sound acceptable for a question like that, it could be a red flag as well, or I like to think of it as a red flag. It could mean that there's maybe a bit of a communication problem, and maybe even a bit of a culture problem as well within the company. Finally as well, you probably want to ask about sort of what technologies they're using and stuff as well. If it hasn't come up already, if you are a software developer, for example, you might want to ask them about sort of technologies and things. If they respond with some questionable ones that maybe have been deprecated for years, that's your decision whether you want to go into that or not. If they come out with, say, we're working with the latest version of jQuery, right, you might want to go but again, that's more of a personal preference thing. I personally, especially as a relative newbie to the industry, I like to work with sort of not necessarily the latest and greatest, not the latest JavaScript framework of the week or anything like that, but just I like to keep up to date with relevant technologies and stuff that's pushing things forward, so stuff that's progressive and new, right? Learning sort of legacy frameworks and legacy tools and stuff isn't going to help your career, basically, and it can also be spaghetti code and difficult to work with. You ideally, in my opinion, want to stick with the newer stuff, but it's entirely up to you, that one. I just like to stay clear of the legacy stuff as much as I can, and I like to sort of work on projects that I feel are sort of pushing things forward and doing something interesting. You might not necessarily have that sort of freedom and choice, whatever situation you're in. But yeah, if you do have the choice, then, absolutely pick the newer one over the old, so to speak, if you have, say, multiple offers, right? Finally, as well, in terms of other questions to ask, first of all, just ask as many as you can. Like, depending on what situation you're in, you want to ask stuff that's relevant to your own sort of work style and lifestyle as well. But one that I specifically like to ask as well as a software engineer and relating to sort of work-life balance is their sort of attitude towards like flexible working and office working versus remote and things like that. If your job can be done remotely, if you're a software engineer, for example, you might be someone who likes to work in the office, right? You might be someone who likes to work hybrid. You might be someone who prefers to work fully remote. But the point of this question is more to gauge their sort of openness and flexibility to people's different ways of working, even if it's just different hours of the day, rather than sort of a rigid 9 to 5. A lot of companies are doing sort of either 4-day work weeks or 9-day fortnights and things like that. As well, and different hours of the day, depending on how the company operates. It might not necessarily be possible, but some companies also allow their sort of software engineers or whatever marketing people or anyone in the company really to work at different hours of the day, as long as it doesn't necessarily impact the project or any sort of clients they're working with or things like that. It's more just to gauge flexibility more than anything, because that can be important for, as I said, work-life balance, mental health. Sometimes you might need to take some time for yourself. You might need to take a holiday or something. You might need to take some bereavement. Something's happened in your personal life. And a flexible company will be much more open to stuff like that, and they'll be willing to give you that time to take for yourself and work on yourself and stay happy and not get burnt out and things. And ultimately pushing you to another job again. That also means that generally I find that more flexible companies in that sense are open to personal development time as well, and a lot of them will give that back as sort of paid time as well. A lot of companies in tech especially, where there's technical roles that constantly need to be kept on top on and things, technical skills that you can't just leave to the wind and just ignore for years. A lot of companies will give like time back, say at the end of a sprint, every 2-week cycle of work if you're not a software engineer. And they can be invaluable to your learning, to your sort of be able to keep up with the times and keep up with the relevant technologies and things. And that all comes back to, as I said right at the start, stay prepared. If you're in a role or where you've got personal development time, or even if you've been made redundant or something like that, personal development time is huge. It's time that you can use to spend to work on all of this stuff. And then hopefully you'll land that job within weeks of being made redundant, or weeks of whenever you start looking for a role, basically. Whenever you need to jump ship for whatever reason, you hopefully will be prepared for it, and you can do it with minimal stress and get that role that you want. But yeah, that's it from me. If you liked the video, like, subscribe. I'm going to do more of these in the new year, more sort of tips, advice and things like that. The last few videos have been more sort of relevant topics and news and things like that in tech. And I still want to do that stuff because I find that stuff quite fun. Just sort of quick videos to get out that's sort of relevant, interesting topics to me in tech that a lot of people can sort of get on board with as well, given that they're relevant at the time. But I want to do more sort of tips and advice stuff as well, as I've sort of learned more over the past year and sort of talk about what I've learned and things. And yeah, if you want to hear more of that stuff and more stuff in this sort of similar vein going into next year, then, as I said before, like, subscribe, and I will see you in the new year. Thank you, and take care. Bye for now.